The glass tower of Monroe Enterprises pierced the brilliant morning sky like a silver blade, reflecting sunlight as if silently declaring its power and perfection. Inside, on the 23rd floor, where the air was thick with expectation and pressure, 12 candidates sat in a perfectly aligned row, each one the embodiment of absolute polish. Their suits were impeccably pressed, their shoes shined to a mirror finish, and each expensive leather briefcase resting on their laps held pristine resumes printed on premium paper. In the cold, marble-land room lit by bright white lights, the scent of high-end coffee mingled with luxurious perfume, a signature aroma that only places fueled by sky-high ambition could generate. Standing at the center of the room was Miranda Fowler, the Director of Human Resources, a woman with perfectly coiffed blonde curls and a steel-glass tailored suit that hugged her slender frame like it had been cut specifically for authority. She checked her watch for the third time, her impatience unmistakable in her gaze. "We need someone who understands the importance of punctuality," Miranda said, her voice sharp as a razor. She glanced at the candidates sitting upright, waiting to be judged. None of them spoke, but their eyes sparkled with competitiveness. Suddenly, the elevator bell chimed. All heads turned toward the steel doors that had just opened. The air in the room seemed to freeze. The woman who stepped out looked as though she'd just walked through a storm, quite literally. Rachel Carter staggered in. Her once white blouse was now a map of mud, water, and tears. Her jeans clung to her tired legs, soaked and heavy, while her dark hair hung in wet, tangled strands. Her face was streaked with dirt, except for a few clean lines left by tears that had carved paths through the grime. Clutched in her arms was a cheap plastic folder, the only thing that hadn't been washed away by the flood, though it was now wrinkled and waterlogged. Her voice trembled as she approached the reception desk. Barely audible, I'm Rachel Carter. I'm here for the 9:30 interview." The room fell into complete silence. Valerie, the receptionist, whose makeup was flawless and suit wrinkle-free, looked at her as if Rachel had stepped out of an apocalyptic movie. She raised an eyebrow, checking the appointment list. "You're Rachel Carter?" Her tone was both a confirmation and a question. Rachel gave a slight nod, struggling to stand up straight, even though every movement sent pain through her body. A small stream of water continued to drip from her sleeve, onto the polished marble floor. "You do realize you're nearly an hour late?" Miranda's voice rang out, cold and unforgiving. She approached with her clipboard held like a shield, defending her devotion to corporate order. "And you appear to have brought part of the wilderness with you," Miranda added, glancing at the muddy puddles forming on the floor. A ripple of soft laughter spread through the candidates' row. A man in a charcoal suit whispered something that made the woman next to him cover her mouth, trying to stifle a laugh. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, not from shame, but to summon what little strength she had left. When she opened them again, the weakness was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady resolve, one born not from pride, but from survival. "There was a flash flood in Riverdale last night," she said, her voice firmer. "I live in the Sunrise Trailer Park. The creek rose 8 feet in 3 hours. Miranda remained expressionless. Her face seemed carved from stone, unyielding, unmoved. But Rachel kept going. "I was there when the water hit Mrs. Abernathy's home. She needs an oxygen tank. I had to help her get it out before the gas tanks were submerged." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "The explosion threw us into the water. After we got out, I spent the night at the community shelter. I left everything behind except this." She lifted the battered folder, as if it were her last remaining hope. "Couldn't miss this interview. I just couldn't." This time, the silence in the room was different, heavier, uncomfortable. The smirks faded. The smug looks disappeared. Some candidates began shifting in their seats. Others stared out the window, as if trying to escape the uncomfortable truth Rachel's words had exposed. Miranda stood still for a moment, lips pressed tightly, before finally speaking. Her tone was still distant but less sharp than before. "I appreciate your determination. However, Monroe Enterprises holds to certain standards, and I'm afraid I can wait." Rachel cut in quickly, almost pleading. "I can sit in the hallway, in a corner, anywhere. Just please give me a chance." I've been preparing for this for 2 years. For the first time since she had entered, people truly saw Rachel, not the woman covered in mud, but the fighter beneath. The deep circles under her eyes, her pale skin, the exhaustion etched into her posture, all of it told the story of someone who had walked through fire to stand where she was. In one corner of the room, a man with sandy blonde hair and a modest gray suit looked up quietly. He didn't command attention like Miranda or exude ambition like the other candidates. His name tag read David Williams, HR assistant. Until now, no one had paid him much notice. "Riverdale, that's in Cedar County, right?" he asked gently, his voice low. Rachel nodded, brushing a strand of wet, muddy hair away from her forehead. "Yes, the north side got hit the worst." "I saw something on the news this morning," David replied, his calm blue eyes studying her not with judgment, but with something closer to understanding. "They mentioned casualties." Rachel lowered her head slightly. Her body sagged further, but her voice remained steady. 3 people died, and Mrs. Abernathy's grandson is still missing." That sentence dropped into the room like a lead weight, cracking the artificial calm. It was no longer possible to pretend this was just another day. A tall man with slicked back hair and a look of arrogant confidence let out a mocking snort. "This story is all very touching, but some of us prepared for this interview properly and would prefer not to have our time wasted by charity cases." "Jackson?" Miranda snapped, though her tone lacked conviction. There was something in her eyes that suggested she didn't entirely disagree. Rachel's face flushed red. The mud on her cheeks couldn't hide the rising humiliation. But instead of crumbling, she straightened her back, this time not in defense, but in defiance. "I apologize for how I look, and for being late. But I am qualified for this position," she said, voice clear, proud yet vulnerable. "I graduated summa cum laude from Westlake Community College." Jackson glanced at the clipboard in Miranda's hands and smirked. "So, not Columbia, and clearly no connections to get your foot in the door. How did you get this interview?" Miranda shifted awkwardly, visibly uncomfortable, but before she could answer, Jackson raised his voice, clearly enjoying the spotlight. "Let's be honest, she's only here because of the company's diversity initiative, a nice little story about a trailer park girl pulling herself up by the bootstraps, except she couldn't even manage to show up on time or look presentable." The room went still. A few people gasped. Even in the cutthroat world of corporate recruitment, Jackson had gone too far. Rachel tightened her grip on the folder, her knuckles turning white. In that moment, she nearly broke. The exhaustion, humiliation, and quiet despair surged like crashing waves inside her. But instead of giving in, she stood her ground, took a deep breath, and spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steadier than any other in the room. "My GPA was 3.97. I worked 2 jobs to put myself through college," Rachel continued, each word drawn from memory, steeped in sweat and sleepless nights. "And I still graduated early with nearly a perfect record." Her voice remained calm but firm. Though still covered in mud, no one in that room saw a pitiful woman anymore. They saw a survivor, someone who had fought for her future every step of the way. "For the past 3 years, I've worked as the executive assistant to the CFO at Westlake General Hospital. I didn't just manage schedules and paperwork. I rebuilt the entire administrative filing system, saving the hospital over $30,000, 0 cents annually. She lifted her head, eyes locked forward. I'm proficient in every software system listed in your job post, plus 3 others you didn't even mention. Every word Rachel spoke seemed to stitch together the torn fabric of her dignity. Every detail was proof that she wasn't just a face from a trailer park. She was a resilient individual who had weathered storms and held on to her integrity. Yes, she added, I did live in a trailer park. Did, because I'm not sure what's left after last night's flood, but I was raised to never judge someone by where they're from, only by what they do and who they choose to become. She turned to Jackson, her gaze no longer fearful but lit with rare conviction. I was also taught to help my neighbors when they're in trouble, even if that means showing up to an interview looking like this. Rachel opened her arms slightly, presenting herself, not with shame, but with the honest pride of someone who had endured and kept going. I'm sorry if that offends your sensibilities, Mr. Pennington, but if I had to do it all over again, I would make the same choice. In the corner, David Williams, the quiet man who'd barely spoken all morning, watched silently. There was a new spark in his eyes, not pity, but genuine respect. As Miranda's gaze brushed past him, he lowered his head, hiding his expression beneath a calm exterior. Miranda sighed, glancing at her watch. Ms. Carter, I appreciate your dedication, but I'm afraid we simply can't reschedule. I could interview her. David spoke up, his voice calm but certain, like he had been waiting for the right moment. Miranda turned, visibly surprised. Mr. Williams? That's not really... If you're concerned about my evaluation, you're welcome to review my notes afterward, David continued, composed. It would be a shame to waste Miss Carter's journey, especially considering how far she's come. Rachel looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes. In that instant, her exhausted face seemed to glow faintly, a tiny flame, lit by the belief that her effort hadn't been in vain. The contrast between her and the polished office space became even more stark, like she had stepped out of a different world, one where character was measured by action, not designer shoes. Miranda hesitated, then nodded curtly, as if doing so more out of politeness than belief in Rachel's worth. Very well. Use the small conference room at the end of the hallway. Keep it brief. Her voice made it clear this was nothing more than a formality in her eyes. Thank you, Rachel whispered, her lips trembling. She blinked back tears, swallowing hard to protect the last shred of pride she had left in a day that had already torn her dignity apart more than once. David stood and gathered his notes. As Rachel followed, Jackson muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. Try not to track mud on the carpet, trailer trash. David froze. For a moment, he went completely still. Something flickered across his usually forgettable face, a strange expression, and then, in his eyes, a quiet, burning anger surfaced. It vanished just as quickly, replaced by his usual calm demeanor. He turned to Rachel. This way, Miss Carter. Rachel followed him, clutching her soaked folder as if it were the last shield protecting what remained of her spirit. She had no idea that this very step, this interview she was barely allowed to have, was about to become the turning point of her entire life, and that the future of Monroe Enterprises would never be the same. The small conference room at the end of the hall offered a quiet contrast to the glossy, impersonal corporate setting outside. In that space, everything would begin, not with a resume, not with a polished look, but with the truth of someone who had dared to live with conviction, even when it cost her everything. David Williams gently gestured for Rachel to take a seat, his eyes pausing on her hesitation as she approached the pristine white chair, clearly worried she'd stain it. I'm sorry about the mud, Rachel mumbled, trying to sit just at the edge of the seat to avoid dirtying the fabric. David waved it off with a calm, assured tone. Chairs can be cleaned. People who've survived a morning like yours deserve to sit. That kindness, so unexpected after the coldness and judgment she had just faced, momentarily rendered Rachel speechless. She lowered her gaze, opening her water-damaged folder, carefully trying to smooth out the rugged pages, each one a testament to the rugged path she had traveled. What Rachel didn't know, what no one in the building knew, was that David Williams wasn't an HR assistant at all. He was David Monroe, the 42-year-old billionaire founder and CEO of Monroe Enterprises. It was a long-standing habit of his to occasionally go undercover, posing as a junior staffer to observe how his company truly operated and, more importantly, how people behaved when they thought no one powerful was watching. And today what he'd seen had left him more disappointed than inspired. "Before we begin," David said, sliding a bottle of water toward Rachel, "would you like a moment to collect yourself?" Rachel gave a small nod, accepting the water gratefully. Then she shook her head. "Thank you, but I've already delayed too much." David nodded, his gaze steady but not imposing. He thought of the candidates in the waiting room, many of whom had spent half an hour in the restroom perfecting their reflection. And then he looked at the woman before him. She looked like she had been dragged through a river, which, he reminded himself, she practically had. And yet, her eyes held only focus, purpose. "Tell me about the flood," he said, ignoring the scripted interview questions on the page in front of him. Rachel paused, surprised. I don't think that's relevant to the job qualification." David offered a slight smile. "Indulge me." Rachel exhaled slowly, then began. The emergency siren started around midnight. By 1 a.m. the water was already rushing into the lower trailers. Mrs. Abernathy. She's 78 and lives alone since her daughter moved to Arizona. She needs an oxygen tank and couldn't leave on her own. I had to get her out before the water reached the propane tanks. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling slightly. We had just made it out when they exploded. After that, I went back to the community center to help the others. And instead of securing your own belongings, David continued, not as a question but a quiet, profound observation, you stayed to help. Rachel shrugged lightly. I didn't think about it much. People needed help, that's all. Through the glass wall, David noticed Miranda walking by. Her eyes narrowed as they landed on the once pristine white chair, now smudged with mud. She made a subtle gesture, suggesting he wrap things up. David nodded politely but didn't budge, his focus fully on the woman in front of him. He opened the folder before him and carefully separated the damp pages. Your resume says you've worked at Westlake General for 3 years. Before that, you were in community college while holding 2 jobs, at a coffee shop and a hardware store. Rachel nodded. Mornings at the coffee shop, evenings and weekends at the hardware store. They were flexible enough to let me work around my class schedule. David thought of the silver spoon candidates still waiting outside. People who had never stood on their feet for 8 hours straight. Never been yelled at over a late latte, never worked back-to-back shifts just to cover rent. They could talk all they wanted about soft skills and leadership mindset, but how many had faced adversity without crumbling? That must have been tough, he said. It was, Rachel admitted, her voice steady, but nothing worth having ever comes easy. David studied her carefully. There was something about her, not just her circumstances or perseverance, but something deeper, a quality he had learned to recognize after conducting thousands of interviews. Quiet grit. The kind of person who wouldn't fold under pressure. The kind of soul that held companies together, not with fancy degrees, but with unshakable purpose. This woman possessed something rare, something you couldn't list on a resume or measure in certifications. David Monroe had sensed it the moment she stepped off the elevator, covered in mud yet unwavering. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Miranda stepped in without waiting for an invitation, her expression cold and her voice just above a whisper. "Mr. Williams, I need a word." David stood, politely excused himself, and stepped into the hallway with her. "This doesn't need to be drawn out," Miranda said, her tone clipped, her jaw tight. "We have qualified candidates who didn't show up looking like that." She gestured toward the meeting room with a subtle tilt of her head, her eyes sharp with judgment. "Spending time on someone like her only undermines the professionalism of this company. Clearly, she's not Monroe material." David said nothing at first. He kept his face composed, but deep inside, quiet anger stirred. Miranda, his right hand for 8 years, known for her efficiency and loyalty, was, in that moment, a mirror of what he feared Monroe Enterprises had become: cold, calculating, and heartless. "She deserves to finish her story," he said softly, almost as a whisper. "I'm going to finish the interview." "Mr. Monroe wouldn't approve," Miranda replied, still unaware of who she was actually speaking to. "We have standards to uphold." A hint of bitter amusement flickered across David's lips. "Give me 15 minutes." Miranda exhaled dramatically, shoulders sinking. 5. Then send her on her way. And we'll need to sanitize that chair. As she turned to leave, David lingered in the hallway. Something inside him had shifted. When had his company, the dream he'd built with sweat and sleepless nights, become so sterile? Had his absence from the ground floor allowed the soul of Monroe Enterprises to be replaced by appearances? Returning to the conference room, he found Rachel still gently arranging the papers in her water-damaged folder. Certificates, recommendation letters, all warped by the flood, but treated with deep care, as if honoring every step of the journey they represented. "Sorry about the interruption," David said as he sat, his voice warm. "It's okay. I understand." Rachel gave a small, bittersweet smile. "Thank you for even giving me a few minutes. Not everyone would have." That quiet gratitude, unpolished and without expectation, was what sealed David Monroe's decision. In that moment, still disguised as David Williams, he knew, no matter what was on Rachel's resume, her grit, her moral compass, and her authenticity were exactly what Monroe Enterprises desperately needed. But there was still one final thing he had to know. "I noticed you mentioned volunteer work at a children's hospital during college," he said, flipping to the last page of her resume. "Would you tell me about that?" Rachel looked surprised, then nodded slowly. As she began to speak, all the exhaustion and discomfort seemed to fall away. A different light emerged, genuine passion. She talked about the kids battling illness, about reading storybooks during chemo sessions, about a world where every smile was a tiny miracle. David listened closely, nodding. With every passing second, he became more certain. Rachel Carter wasn't just a candidate. She was a reminder of decency, of humanity, of the reason he started this company in the first place. Behind the mud-streaked clothes was a soul that could move mountains. "Your full name is Rachel Carter?" David asked, pen hovering midair. "Yes, that's right." Something sparked in his eyes, not suspicion, but recognition. He glanced back at her resume, her date of birth, 8 years ago. She would have been 17. "You lived in Millfield before moving to the trailer park, didn't you?" he asked. Rachel's brow furrowed slightly, confused. "Yes, but why are you asking? Does that have anything to do with the job?" David didn't respond right away. His fingers tapped the table softly, his mind racing between memory and present. "Excuse me for just a moment, Miss Carter," he said, standing. His chair made a soft sound as it slid back. "Please, take your time with the water. I'll be right back." Rachel watched him, bewildered, not understanding what had just shifted in the room. David walked briskly down the hallway, brushing past Miranda's watchful gaze. He headed straight for the temporary office assigned to David Williams. A modest space, a far cry from his actual office on the top floor with sweeping views of the city, but this was where he needed to be right now. Locking the door behind him, he bent down to unlock a drawer in the desk. Inside, he reached past a family photo and pulled out a clear plastic folder. Old, worn, and carefully preserved. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping. 17-year-old girl saves 3 children from Millfield fire. Rescuer declines interviews. Leaves only a name. Rachel C. David Monroe stared at the faded print, his heart pounding as if time had rewound. The headline, bold but blurred with age, read, "School bus crash claims 2 lives, 12 injured." Beneath it, a photo showed a yellow school bus overturned amid thick black smoke, its frame mangled, the scene so haunting that David could almost still smell the gasoline and scorched rubber. He could still hear the scream. Emma, his only sister, had been 14, returning from a school trip when the bus driver suffered a heart attack, sending the vehicle careening into a ravine. In the chaos, a young girl had shattered the rear window with a rock and pulled out several children, including Emma, just moments before the bus exploded into flames. It had taken David weeks to piece together the mystery through scattered witness accounts. The only name he had was Rachel Carter, but the girl had vanished. No interviews, no spotlight, no awards. The article, and a blurry photo of a dark-haired teenager turning away from the camera, was all he had for 8 years. He had even created a scholarship in honor of the anonymous heroine, hoping one day he could finally say, "Thank you." And now, in a strange twist of fate, she was sitting in his conference room, mud-splattered, exhausted, and fresh from another rescue. David returned, the laminated article clenched in his hand. Through the glass, he saw Rachel sitting upright, her eyes fixed on the door, willing herself to stay strong. "Sorry for the sudden interruption," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. Rachel offered a faint smile, exhaustion etched across her face. "It's okay. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me." David sat down slowly, placing the old newspaper between them on the table. "Miss Carter, did you attend Millfield High School?" Rachel blinked, confused. "Yes, I was there for 3 years before my family moved." "You remember a school bus accident, spring of 2016? The question hit like a hammer to the chest. Rachel's face went pale. Her hands, mid-motor while organizing her papers, froze. The air around her thickened with old memories and unspoken pain. "Why are you asking me that?" she whispered, voice cracking. David turned the article around so she could read it. "Because I've been searching for you for 8 years. Rachel's eyes locked onto the grainy image, a teenage girl with dark hair turning her back to the camera, hidden in the crowd. Recognition flickered in her gaze, followed by shock. "I don't understand. Why were you looking for me?" David's voice softened, filled with something he hadn't said aloud in years. "The 14-year-old girl you pulled out last... the one with a broken arm and smoke inhalation. She's my sister. Emma Monroe." Rachel stopped breathing. Her throat tightened. "Monroe. You're..." David nodded. "David Monroe, not Williams. I'm sorry I didn't say sooner." He broke off, her eyes widened, stunned into silence. "Emma had nightmares for months," he continued. "She'd wake up screaming about the fire, the smoke. But in all of that, she kept talking about an angel. A girl who broke the window, pulled her out, held her close, and whispered, 'You're going to be okay. You're strong enough to survive this.'" Tears welled in Rachel's eyes. Her voice trembled. "I wasn't an angel. I was just there. Anyone would have done the same." David shook his head, voice thick with emotion. "But no one else did. Only you. And then, you disappeared. No interviews. No name." "Did you do it?" he asked. eyes searching hers for something deeper than words. Rachel met his gaze, unflinching. Because it had to be done. Because they needed help. Just like last night. I didn't wade through mud for hours because I wanted to. I did it because I couldn't turn my back on people crying for help. David studied her face, worn down but resilient, dirty but radiant. She wasn't just strong. She was the embodiment of what he feared his company had lost: compassion, integrity, and a belief that worth isn't defined by polish, but by purpose. "My sister," Rachel said softly, hesitating. "Is she okay?" David smiled, eyes glinting. "Emma, she's incredible. In med school now, top of her class. Still talks about the angel who saved her every time someone brings up the crash." A tear rolled down Rachel's cheek, cutting a clean path through the mud. David rose from his chair, his voice filled with quiet authority. "Ms. Carter, I think it's time we continue this conversation under more honest circumstances." Rachel blinked, her expression caught between disbelief and hope, as David smiled and opened the door. "That are you. I believe there are a few people out there who need a lesson in judgment." The reception area fell completely silent as David Monroe emerged with Rachel Carter at his side. The sharply dressed candidates straightened in their seats, eyes narrowing with curiosity and apprehension. Miranda Fowler, mid-sentence in her instructions to a fellow HR associate, froze, her pen hovering mid-air. "Is something wrong, Mr. Williams?" she asked, her voice tight, eyes flicking nervously to the mud-covered woman beside him. David smiled calmly. "Nothing wrong at all, Miss Fowler. In fact, something has just become very right." He turned to face the room, his voice clear and steady. "Let me reintroduce myself. I'm not David Williams." He reached into his inner pocket and handed Miranda a silver business card. Her face went pale as she read it. "David Monroe, founder and CEO, Monroe Enterprises." Silence crashed over the room. Several candidates shifted uncomfortably. The receptionist's fingers froze mid-keystroke. "I occasionally observe our hiring process incognito," David continued. "It gives me insight into how this company truly functions when no one knows I'm watching." David glanced around the room, his eyes lingering a little longer on Jackson Pennington, whose smug smile had now completely vanished. "Today has been a valuable lesson." Miranda attempted to regain her composure. "Mr. Monroe, if only we had known." "That's exactly the point, Miss Fowler," David cut in, his voice quiet but clear as crystal. He then turned back to Rachel. "But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Miss Carter hasn't had the chance to present her qualifications." Rachel swallowed hard, still stunned by the revelation. "I don't think that's necessary anymore, Mr. Monroe." "No," David said gently. "I want everyone here to hear it. They need to hear it." Rachel drew a deep breath and began. She spoke about her academic journey, working 2 jobs simultaneously, graduating early, and how she restructured the hospital's filing system to save tens of thousands of dollars. Her voice grew stronger, steadier, like when she had shattered the school bus window 8 years ago. A quiet strength, not proven by appearances, but by action. David raised a hand to pause her. He lifted the laminated newspaper article, the light reflecting off the faded print. 8 years ago, a school bus crashed in Millfield. The driver had a heart attack. The bus veered off a ravine, then caught fire. My sister Emma was trapped inside with 13 other students. The doors jammed. The flames reached the gas line. He handed the article to Miranda. She took it, her eyes glued to the bold headline, "Mysterious Teen Saves Students in Horrific Bus Crash." While others stood around filming with their phones, a 17-year-old girl picked up a rock, shattered the back window, and climbed into the fire, David said, voice catching. "She rescued 6 students. The last was my sister. her arm broken, unconscious from smoke inhalation. 30 seconds after she dragged Emma out, the bus exploded. The room collectively held its breath. Even Jackson was now perched at the edge of his seat, the arrogance drained from his face. David turned to Rachel, his eyes no longer those of a CEO, but of a brother forever in her debt. The 10th girl was Rachel Carter. Every gaze in the room turned to the mud-streaked woman, her hands trembling as she clutched her battered folder. Is this true?" Miranda asked, her voice barely audible. Rachel nodded slightly, lips pressed in modest affirmation. "I just did what anyone would have done." David turned back to the room, his voice deep and resonant, "is exactly what makes her extraordinary." His eyes swept across the seated candidates' faces now solemn, stripped of smugness, stilled by a lesson that no textbook could teach. "Not everyone would have done that," he said. "Not everyone would give up everything, spend the night wading through floodwaters to save others, and still show up for an interview, because she refused to let her one shot at a better future slip away." He gently placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, reverence in every motion. "Miss Carter didn't know who my sister was. She never sought fame or reward. She saw people in danger and acted. And this morning, when I watched every one of you judge her for the mud on her clothes, I finally realized what Monroe Enterprises has been missing." Rachel looked up, her eyes still clouded with confusion. "Courage," David said, "compassion, and the willingness to get your hands dirty when others are in need." Miranda's face had gone from stunned to calculating. "Mr. Monroe, this is certainly an extraordinary coincidence, but perhaps we should continue this conversation in your office." "It's not a coincidence, Miss Fowler," David said, his voice suddenly sharp as a blade. "It's character, it's integrity." He straightened his stance, his presence filling the room. "Character isn't found in a suit. It doesn't come from your family tree or who you know. It's what you do when no one's watching." He turned to Rachel with a look no longer filled with gratitude, but with trust. "Character is stepping into a burning bus. It's showing up when you've lost everything." Rachel's throat tightened, the emotional weight of the morning, the flood, the despair, the ridicule, the humiliation of showing up unfit, and now this unexpected recognition, all of it surged back at once. "Mr. Monroe, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, Miss Carter." David smiled. "I'm the one who has something to say." That he stood tall. The sunlight from the glass panels behind him cast his figure in a commanding glow, the kind you'd expect when a legend is born. "Rachel Carter will not be continuing the interview for the executive assistant position." The room went still. Rachel swayed slightly, her shoulders sinking for a moment. Maybe, she thought, despite it all, this was still a no. Just a very polite, very public no. She bent down, beginning to gather her soggy, wrinkled folder. But David wasn't done. "She won't be taking the assistant position," he said, voice rising with purpose, "because Rachel Carter will be joining Monroe Enterprises' senior executive team under a special mentorship program, under my personal direction." The room gasped. A loud clack echoed as Miranda's clipboard hit the floor. She stood, frozen, face pale as a sheet. Jackson Pennington, the man who had mocked her, now clutched the arms of his chair like a man hanging off a ledge. His jaw dropped open in disbelief. The receptionist remained still, fingers frozen above the keyboard. And Rachel, the center of it all, looked as though the words still hadn't registered. I'm sorry, what did you just say?" she whispered, eyes wide, lips trembling between disbelief and awe. David smiled. But this time it wasn't just warmth. It was conviction. It was the look of a man placing faith in someone the world had overlooked. "I'm offering you a position that doesn't technically exist yet," he said. You'll work directly with me, learning how this company operates from the top down." Miranda was the first to recover, stepping forward with a brittle smile designed more to save face than show support. "Mr. Monroe, while this is certainly a moving story, I must remind you that we have strict hiring protocols for all executive positions. The leadership track requires—" David cut her off, gently but decisively. "I'm well aware of what our protocols require, Miss Fowler. I wrote most of them. And I'm also aware that over time they've become barriers, not gateways, to identifying people who actually deserve to lead." He turned back to the room, his presence now that of a leader stepping onto a podium. "What is the mission we at Monroe Enterprises proudly claim to uphold?" A young woman in the front row spoke softly but clearly. "Innovation, excellence, and integrity, sir." "Exactly," David nodded. "And yet, what I've seen lately says otherwise. We've been selecting candidates based on appearance instead of action, pedigree instead of competence, and compliance instead of courage." He gestured toward Rachel, who still stood beside him, mud-stained and disheveled, yet now radiating a quiet strength that silenced the entire room. "The thing, she saved my sister's life at 17. No one asked her to, no one called for help, and then she disappeared, asking for nothing in return. Last night she saved an elderly woman from a flood and gave up nearly everything she owned to do it. And this morning, when she walked into this building, all she received in return was scorn. For a little mud." Jackson stared at the floor, his lips pressed tightly together, his eyes refusing to rise. "This company, my company, has lost its way," David continued, his voice trembling slightly for the first time. "We've become so obsessed with polished resumes and tailored appearances that we've forgotten what truly matters: character, courage, and the willingness to do what's right, even when no one is watching." Rachel stood taller than ever before. For the first time, the mud on her clothes wasn't a mark of hardship, it was a badge of honor, a living testament to a kind of value no resume could ever capture. Miranda attempted to interject again, this time with genuine concern in her voice. "Mr. Monroe, perhaps we can make an exception for Miss Carter, but surely you don't mean to change our entire hiring process based on one exceptional case?" "No," David said, his voice low but firmer than ever. "I'm not considering change. I'm deciding it. Miss Fowler," he said, turning to her, his tone no longer angry, just deeply disappointed. "You tried to dismiss Miss Carter without even giving her an interview. Despite her qualifications, despite her undeniable will." David faced Miranda fully now, his gaze piercing through the polished professionalism she wore like armor. "You showed no compassion for her circumstances and not the slightest curiosity about the person beneath the mud. You chose procedure over doing what's right." Miranda opened her mouth to respond, but David continued, his voice low, resonant like a bell tolling the end of an era. "What we call procedure has become a shield against basic decency." He let the silence stretch, allowing the words to settle like a judgment that needed no appeal. The room fell still, paralyzed. Rachel looked around, no longer afraid. The faces that had mocked her, judged her for the watermarks and grime, were now lowered in shame. These were people dressed in perfect suits, holding polished resumes, and yet suddenly they looked like actors in a play, well-costumed, well-rehearsed, but hollow. David turned to Jackson Pennington. "And you, Mr. Pennington?" Jackson flinched, his spine stiffening. "Your words to Miss Carter are the epitome of the arrogance and elitism I will no longer tolerate in this company." "But, sir," Jackson stammered, his face flushing red, trying to maintain composure. "I have 3 years of experience at Goldman Sachs. My father golfs with—" "I don't care who your father golfs with. David cut him off, his voice cold as steel. I care about who you are when you think no one important is watching, and this morning I watched you mock someone who had just spent the night saving lives. The room seemed to shudder. A few candidates shifted awkwardly, their faces flushed with unease and realization. David turned back to Rachel, this time his voice soft and steady, like an older brother speaking from the heart. I know this is a lot, Miss Carter. You came here for an interview, not a life-altering moment. If you need time to consider my offer. I don't, Rachel said, cutting in gently but firmly. Though her voice still bore the weight of exhaustion, something within her had broken free, an invisible cage she'd lived in far too long. I accept. And for the first time since walking into the building, Rachel smiled. A full, radiant smile. Not forced, not polite, but real. It lit her face from within, cutting through the mud, erasing the fatigue, revealing the resolve forged through storms and fire. Perfect, David nodded, his expression lighting up as though he'd just recovered a part of his company's soul that had long been lost. Valerie, he called to the receptionist who was still frozen in disbelief. Yes, Mr. Monroe. Please arrange for Miss Carter to have access to the executive suite and contact Thomas in facilities. Have a private office set up for her right next to mine. Valerie nodded so quickly it was almost a bow. Right away, sir. David turned to the rest of the room. His voice, when it came again, rolled like thunder across a cloudless sky. As for the rest of you, everyone looked up, breath held. You have a choice. He paused, letting the words settle. If you genuinely want to work at Monroe Enterprises, a new Monroe Enterprises, where human value is measured by courage, integrity, and action, then I invite you to reapply under the new criteria. And if not, he shrugged lightly, I wish you well somewhere else. He turned to Rachel once more, his gaze warm. Miss Carter, please come with me. We have much to discuss, starting with finding you some dry clothes and a place to stay until your housing situation is resolved. David Monroe, the man behind a global empire, now walked side by side with a woman in muddy shoes and a soaked, wrinkled folder. And together, they stepped into the executive elevator, a place reserved for the very top. The doors slid closed behind them. The room remained frozen in silence. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loud. Only once the elevator was gone did the air erupt in hushed murmurs, as if an invisible door to a new reality had just opened. Miranda Fowler stood frozen in place like a statue carved from stone amid a storm. The world she once controlled, order, protocol, dominance, had just been upended by a mud-stained woman and an unshakable belief in doing what was right. The Monroe Enterprises of yesterday was gone. A new era had begun. Not from strategy or finance, but from a single moment of humanity. A single act of courage. And nothing would ever be the same. 3 months later, Rachel Carter walked through the grand lobby of Monroe Enterprises. Her steps were steady, confident, a far cry from the soaked and trembling figure she had once been. Today, she wasn't here to ask for an opportunity. She was part of the transformation. Employees on either side of the hall smiled and nodded with respect. The same security guard who once hesitated to let her in now greeted her warmly by name. Good morning, Director Carter. Rachel wore a tailored navy full suit, elegant in its simplicity. Strong enough for a boardroom and practical enough to wade through mud if needed. Around her neck hung a silver pendant shaped like a small rock, a symbol of the moment that changed her life, when she had used such a rock to shatter a bus window and save lives. She paused briefly as the elevator doors reflected her image. Sometimes it still felt impossible to believe how much had changed in a single, rain-soaked morning. On the executive floor, a calm, focused energy filled the space. Jerome, Her assistant, a young man who had grown up in the same trailer park Rachel once called home, was waiting with a hot coffee and a tablet in hand. "Disaster relief applications are up 15% this week," he reported as they walked. "And Mr. Monroe wants to see you before the board meeting." Rachel nodded, scanning the list of tasks. "Thanks, Jerome. How's your mom settling into the new house?" Jerome's face lit up. "She loves it. She keeps talking about her garden." Rachel chuckled. "Great. Don't forget to invite me to the housewarming. I'm not letting you leave me out." They stopped in front of her office. A gleaming plaque read, "Rachel Carter, Executive Director of Community Impact Initiatives," a role that had never existed before, created just for her, born of David Monroe's vision and belief. The office was spacious, flooded with natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows. But the wall Rachel faced most often wasn't the one with the city skyline. It was a map, dotted with hundreds of colored pins, each one marking a community project she had spearheaded across the country. Over the past 3 months, David had kept his promise. Under his mentorship, Rachel had learned quickly and worked hard. But more importantly, she had brought back what the company had lost: a view from the ground, from the people whose lives were shaped by corporate decisions. A soft knock pulled her from her thoughts. David Monroe stepped inside, his familiar figure now fully in CEO form. Sharp black suit, composed eyes of someone who'd built an empire. "Got a minute?" he asked, a warm smile peeking through his executive facade. "For the man who changed my life?" Rachel grinned. "I think I can spare a few." David sat down, looking uncharacteristically hesitant, a rare expression on him. "I've got something for you," he said, placing a folder on her desk. "Actually, 2 things." Rachel opened it. Inside was a proposal titled, "The Monroe Overlooked Talent Initiative." "We're going to make what started with you official," David explained. "Seeking out exceptional people who've never had access to places like this. Full scholarships, apprenticeships, direct mentorship. You'll lead the program." Rachel looked up, her eyes misty. "And the second?" David smiled, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a lapel pin, a small flame crafted in white gold. "The new symbol of the program," he said. "Not just to honor the one who saved my sister, but all those who walk through fire for others." Rachel gently picked up the pin, unable to speak through the emotion welling up inside her. "This program," she whispered, "could change thousands of lives." "That's the plan," David replied, eyes steady. "And I want you to lead it." He leaned forward, voice low and earnest, no longer just a CEO, but someone who deeply believed in her. "You've proven that talent and character can come from anywhere. A trailer park, a disaster zone, even a job interview covered in mud." Rachel laughed softly, eyes gleaming. "Miranda Fowler still hasn't been able to look me in the eye." "She's learning," David said diplomatically. "Slowly." Rachel tilted her head, playfully. "And Jackson Pennington?" David laughed, eyes twinkling. "Last I heard, he's telling everyone he turned us down for moral reasons." Rachel shook her head, returning to the documents, her demeanor serious again. "This initiative is incredible, David. But you said there were 2 surprises." "Yes," he checked his watch. "The second one should be here, now." At that moment, Rachel's desk intercom buzzed. "Miss Carter, someone is here to see you. Says she has an appointment," Jerome announced. "Send her in," David replied, rising from his seat. The door opened, and a young woman stepped in, her eyes the same blue as David's, her smile bright as morning sun. Her white coat bore the emblem of the local medical school. Rachel gasped softly, heart catching in her chest. "Emma." Emma Monroe crossed the room quickly and embraced Rachel without hesitation. "My brother said he finally found you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Rachel held her tight, memories flooding back. The last time she'd seen Emma, she was a soot-covered 14-year-old with a broken arm, being loaded into an ambulance. "I've wanted to thank you for 8 years," Emma said as she stepped back, her eyes shimmering. "When David told me you were here, I almost didn't believe it." "Today is a special day," David added gently. Rachel lifted her head. "It's the anniversary of the bus crash." Emma nodded and reached into her bag, pulling out a small box. Inside was a crystal plaque, etched with the image of a school bus, a small stone, and the words, "To Rachel Carter, who taught us that courage doesn't need to be seen, only done, even when no one is watching. With eternal gratitude, the Monroe family." Rachel's hands trembled as she took the plaque. I don't know what to say." "That's what makes you special," David said with a smile. "You don't talk, you just act." Emma took Rachel's hand and teased gently. "Honestly, I almost didn't recognize you without all the mud." They all laughed, a shared joy echoing across the office like sunlight pouring through the windows. Outside, the city stretched into the horizon, and there, in the Riverside district, the first buildings of a flood-resistant housing project designed for survivors of the Sunrise Trailer Park flood were rising from the ground. The first would be completed next month, funded by Monroe Enterprises, designed with direct input from the very people who would live there. Rachel placed the plaque on her desk, glancing at it with reverence. In her mind, she saw again the day she walked into this building, mud-covered, exhausted, holding nothing but a waterlogged folder and a threadbare hope for employment. She hadn't found a job that day. She had found a mission. What had started as a desperate attempt to survive had become a purpose, a family, a chance to become the guiding light for others. The very thing that had once marked her for ridicule, the mud, had become the foundation of something revolutionary. Not just personal success, but a movement of compassion and humanity. "Are you ready for the board meeting?" David asked. "I think today's the day they approve the disaster response expansion." Rachel stood, lifting her tablet, her eyes shining with quiet fire. "Then let's go change some more lives." And so they walked out, one billionaire, one doctor, and one woman who once lived in a trailer park. Rachel smiled, her heart full of gratitude. Sometimes, to make the world a cleaner, better place, you have to be willing to get a little dirty.